Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for attending UNBC Northwest Campus Elder in Residence. The motto of UNBC is, we'll do a little quiz, En Chuhana. What does that mean?
Out of the north or the north.
Well, that's how some people interpret it. En Chuhana actually means, it comes from the Sakani saying, it means respecting different ways of knowing or knowledge. And that's supposed to be the overall ethos of our university, and I think nothing represents that better than the program that we're here today, which is the Elder in Residence program, which brings together people from First Nations communities, local elders, hereditary chiefs, people of that particular ilk, to the university to share knowledge and ideas with we in the academy, both as faculty members and staff and students. I'm really excited. This is the first time in a formal way, I guess, we've had it outside of Prince George. Deidre was saying we had it once in Skinnigat, but the first time ever here at our UNBC campus in Northwest, in Terrace, and hopefully it's something that we can continue with time. Our particular elder in residence is Mr. Mel Bevan. I'm just trying to think of how I can introduce him. Mel has been around since pretty much the mountains were here. He told me he and his family were the ones who cleared the first land on Queensway where the reserve currently exists today. So that's how far back Mel goes. He has had a storied career, both in terms of the Kitselas community and as well as in government and governance. Mel has served as a band manager, a counselor, probably a number of other titles as well. He currently also continues to serve as a treaty negotiator for both the Kitselas First Nations and Tsimshian. Mel brings over 50 years of experience in governance with First Nations communities, and he has been graceful enough to include us today in sharing his knowledge. So I hope you will join me in giving a round of applause to our Northwest Campus Elder in Residence, Mel Bevan.
Thank you. I normally have a very soft voice, so if you can't hear me, wave your arm. And so I'll do what I can. When Bruce first approached me about this, the first thing I told him, I'm not your traditional Indian. I don't sing, I don't dance, I've never prayed in my life. But I do speak the language. And I've grown up my life's been completely different from most people. That's just how it was, right? And now I use the term Indian rather than First Nation because I guess I've always been one Indian, so that's what I call myself. And there's quite a few elders that do the same thing. They're, even though it sounds like we're from India, but that's not how we see it. That's just what they call. The Constitution of Canada still refers to us as Indians. Right? Indian Act covers us. So that's the reason I use it. No, it's not for any other reason. No. And one of the things that I want to go through some of the history of Kitselas. That's the recent history. I just want to talk about it today, about the history of Kitselas, because I've read practically all of the local books that have been written about the Terrace area. Like Frank from Frank's Field East that wrote, and I can't remember them all. E.B.'s, there's a lot of settlers wrote memoirs. And I think there was only one that mentioned Native people. There was no mention at all about Native people in any of the local history. I think the only one was Charles Nelson. He was kind of a famous ball player from Kitselas. He was the only one that got a mention in one of the books. So maybe one day I'll have enough time to write the history of Kitselas. But in the meantime, I want to just go over some of it with you today, just to give you an idea of our our history. That's since contact, not previous history. Because when we were writing this book with Rock from the college, I don't know if you've read the People of Kitselas book. One thing we impressed on them is don't write about us as if we were all dead. We're still alive. We're still here. We didn't all die, so we're not ancient history. Our history is current. So I'm going to just begin. Like that, one of the things that is done in most of these is the traditional welcome. And what is referred to today as the traditional welcome is actually quite recent. Right? And before contact, the various groups that were, or you can define them as separate countries, because they were absolutely independent. Like the Nishka were independent, the Gitchan, the Haida, Haisla. The Kitselas were independent from the Tsimshian. That's kind of a distinction that's most people don't quite get. And also the Kitkatla people don't consider themselves Tsimshian. They're a different group. Right? Tsimshian actually means the mouth of the Skeena. And the Gitchan is upriver. So they're the people in the Skeena. So Kitselas is kind of in between because of our history. And all of these groups had different languages, traditions, and customs. And because they couldn't actually speak it, a lot of them couldn't speak each other's language. So how do you communicate when you meet? How do you know you're not? They're not raiders. They're not there to steal everything you got. So there had to be what one of my lawyer friends from Victoria were trying to look into some of this to see how these laws actually worked. And we came up with the term an international understanding that on how strangers behaved to avoid problems. There were certain rules you had to follow when you met a group. The most common known one is keep your hands on the paddle and don't take them off, so you can see your hands. If you saw that, then you knew. It was kind of a sign language that they developed, right? If you didn't do that, everybody run and get their weapons, right? And there were some very elaborate welcoming ceremonies, such as weddings. A wedding party arriving, there was massive ceremonies that they did. In the old culture, everybody tried to outdo each other. Who put on the best show? A lot of these big potlatch dances and things and that's where a lot of the art comes from, is from all of these dances that were invented, and with the costumes that they wore. And every year they tried to outdo each other, because that was their main entertainment. And the current traditional welcome, which is actually two-sided, because this happened during my lifetime actually, because we were almost disappearing into the Canadian, right? Not because we left, because we're still there. Nobody noticed us. That's really what it was about. And I'm not sure exactly who it was that came up with the idea to start a tradition of welcome, because before that, there was no way to acknowledge that there were Native people here, or whether there were Native people in Prince Rupert or Nishka or Nass or everywhere else. So he came up with this idea of having a welcome for major events. And when I say two-sided, it is two-sided. The welcome thing is acknowledgement, like for UNBC, that they acknowledge the people that live here, and then we also acknowledge you by saying welcome. So that's what I'll do today. I'm welcome to our land, and thank you for acknowledging that we exist. And then Kitselas, get in, there's, my thing is in two parts. One is the traditional territory, Kitselas Territory. I don't really like the word territory. I try and avoid using it because, something that you use for moose, right? Moose territory, grizzly bear territory, Indian territory. So I avoid using it because just to explain myself there, I was born on and speaking my language. I grew up speaking my own language. I had to learn English. Because I had to learn English, I really dug into every word to see what it meant, and I still do that today. So I refer to that as our homelands because that's what they are. The homelands of the Kitselas people. That is what it really is. Now the word Kitselas here means people of the canyon. Git meaning people. Chelas doesn't actually mean canyon. It means a narrow place where the river rushes through. Because all of the words that we have in Tsimshian are descriptive words. They describe something. They're not just names, right? Because our language was never written, so it was. My daughter just walked in. No, it was a land, our legends tell us, was discovered by a group of migrating people. So there's actually quite a few migration stories. And they settled in the area and they successfully defended it, right, for thousands of years. And archaeological digs that were done in the canyon so that they were occupied continuously for 5,000 years. And that's as far as they dug down. I think Dave Walker was the one who was heading. I don't know if any of you remember Dave Walker. You remember him. He was involved in that. And there's a MacDonald, not James MacDonald, but the other MacDonald that ran the National Museum of Man. What was his name? Do you remember? George MacDonald. That's it. He spent years in the canyon doing the digs. Oops, where's my stick? This is a map of what we refer to as the traditional territory. This map is actually a part of the agreement in principle. So as far as we know, it's been agreed by the government of Canada and British Columbia as the official Kitselas Territory. And if we can see it, I'll just point it out here. This is Terrace, Lickels Lake, and the Kitimat River in here. And it sort of runs through Terrace because we also have an agreement with the Kitsim people that we would agree on a line. And there's the Gitchan up here, the Carrier or the Wichowden over here, the Kaisla here, Tsimshian over there. And one of the interesting things about in 1901, I believe it was, when they were establishing the reserves in Kitselas, the tiny little reserves that we have, they asked one of the leaders to show them where the areas were, because we're going to give you some land, is what they told us. So they did. So they pulled in over here, which is now Colspie, Queensway, and they said, we own this, meaning this, everything in that valley. So they went up to the Zimmercord, the Copper River, said, we own this valley. Every creek they took them to and said, we own this. This is ours. So they went away and came back, created tiny little reserves. All these are 200 acres at the mouth of all these creeks. That's the reason there's reserves in the mouth of every creek. Yeah, then and that kind of tricked us, right?
So the Kitselas were referring to the actual, they owned the
Yeah,
entire.
they owned all of this, right? Because the word Kalkspa is actually the right pronunciation for it. You got to use the the Kalkspa. And what that means is the place where you cross over. Now, they used to tie up there down at the beach here, all their canoes, and they would walk over to Kills Lake. And that's where they did a lot of summer picking berries, and they used to use the hot springs quite a bit, right? And then and they were actually the freshwater mussels were actually good to eat back then. There was no pollution then, right? So there was, and they used all that whole area. So the word Kalkspa means crossover. It became a 17-acre reserve, right? So that, and this is the area we refer to as our homeland, as opposed to our traditional territory. Was there any questions on some of this? Yeah.
The boundaries, do they follow a geographical line, or is it just, like, how do they come up?
No, we try to follow like the height of land, because one side of the mountain, right?
Watershed thing.
Yeah, and a lot of our, like, one of the things that because I remember I said we're independent countries, which means you can have wars, right? You can have wars. And we pretty much fought with everybody except there was some that we were friends with. The carrier, for one, the carrier, they're now referred to the Wet'suwet'en. They were called the carrier, but they're now the Wet'suwet'en. We traded with them all the time. We fought with the Gitchan, and that's with the, those of you who know the area, you've heard of Battle Hill. That was built because of us. It's our fault they built that. And we never fought with the Haisla. They were all of us our friends when we first met them. There's actually legends about meeting them, right? The story, that picture you've got there, this is actually based on the legend of the meeting the Haisla. Because we've got a story that's, I don't know how many thousands of years old, talks about some young people climbed to the top of one of the mountains, and they described what they saw. They saw the Kells Lake, and they said it looks like a bear hide spread out. And so they knew where the Kells Lake was, but they also noticed a spot of water far past the Kells Lake, and they couldn't figure out what lake that was. They didn't know if it was a lake, right? So what they did was they walked over there, and they discovered it was the Douglas Channel. They were at the ocean, and that's when they met the Haisla, and they became good friends, and eventually the Haisla came over. Gitaus, the original village of Gitaus was actually a Haisla village, because the people invited them over, and they stayed with us and everything else, right? So in those days, it wasn't, you got to live here, you got to live there. Nobody told, right? We were free. And I always wanted to find out where this mountain was, to see if I can find the spot where they saw this. So I went up, that's that big. I was too lazy to climb, we hired a helicopter. But what I saw was exactly what they described in a really old legend. Right?
So the picture's a reenactment?
Yeah, it was, yeah. Kitselas Mountain.
Which one?
Kitselas Mountain. Because we went to top of Copper Mountain, the top of Bornite Mountain, and Kitselas Mountain. Kitselas was where we saw it. Morris Mason and I went up there. No, we don't actually have an overlap with Calumet. Years ago, because they were pretty much related to each other. Right? There's a lot of people from Calumet that were from Kitselas and so on. So we never ever had a problem with Calumet.
So it would be more accurate to say that this campus sits on Kitselas lands?
It might be, right? Back when we first started doing the welcome thing, there was Ben Bolton, Clifford Bolton. We agreed that we're not going to argue about where the line is, but we'll just simply take turns. That was how we did it. If anything happened, Clifford would phone me up, says, "Your turn." So there wasn't really a problem. I wish that we'd continue doing that because it's so much simpler.
Well, can I share that? I agonized a little bit about like who you're supposed to invite to do a welcoming for this event, and Mel told me about the story about they used to just swap back and forth, right? So he was the one who devised this particular welcome to me.
Yeah, because Clifford and I, same as Ben Bolton when he was chief, we never ever had a problem. Right? The same with Alec Bolton now. I wish no, because he understands. He knows that. Terrace is populated by people, right? We can't go say we own it. See, right? It doesn't quite work. So I'm going to get into if there's no more questions, I'll move on to the, whoops. I see I've used up a half an hour already.
That's why we have you all month.
Usually somebody has to cut me off. Because I tried to think of just what would be important to a group like this. And then, the last war of the Kitselas people took place in the early 1800s. That wasn't very long ago. And the war was with invading Tsimshian, because the Tsimshian were came up and tried to boot us out, and they were repelled. But the interesting part was the legend. This was one of Walter Wright's legends. Is that interesting part of the legend was the people had muskets. That's the Kitselas people had muskets. The Tsimshian didn't have muskets, but the Kitselas people did. And where they got it from, because the carrier people east of us had contact with Simon Fraser and his group long before we did, so they had access to all these muskets. So they traded with us, with the Kitselas peoples. That's how they got the muskets before Europeans came up here. And then there was the first Europeans traveling up by canoe up the river were stopped at what is called the Little Canyon, and that's at the Terrace Bridge by Kitselas people, and told they could pass only if they were going through. They couldn't stay, right? Because that was when they did go through, the Europeans, there was an actual diary. You'll find it in one of those river steamboat books. There's an actual diary in there of the surveyors that Europeans that went up, and they recorded. They said at least 500 Indians were standing on the cliffs watching them go by, and they were surprised that these people had muskets. Right? So the reason I kind of threw that in is because it verifies our legend, right? And they, right. After it wasn't very long after the missionaries started coming. We had so many missionaries, especially Kitselas. The village of Old Kitselas. I have a cabin up there where I'm the only one left up there, and is an actual product of the missionary period. It wasn't, it didn't have long houses. It didn't have any of those things. They were two-story homes, living room, kitchen, all that stuff. And everybody had a picket fence. And they were all measured out 200 feet wide, 200 by about 400 or 500 feet long. Everybody had a garden, everybody had orchards, everybody, just, we weren't Indian no more. That's the only way I can put it.
Mel, that was on the other side of the river.
Yeah, yeah, that's on old Kitselas. No, and just kind of off the side, there's so many different, like there was Salvation Army, United Church. We had Jehovah's Witnesses come around, Seventh-day Adventists. The only thing, there was no Catholics, so that was the Catholics kind of ended at Hagelgit because they were coming east and everybody else was coming west from like. And when I was about 8 years old, I asked my mother, the Salvation Army tells us everybody else is wrong. Pentecostals say all of these people are wrong. Seventh-day Adventists says they got the whole thing wrong. It's not even Sunday, it's Saturday. So I asked her. Who should I believe? And the advice she gave me was, don't believe any of them. So I came to the logical conclusion that if they all thought all the others were wrong, they must all be wrong, right? So whenever he asked me what's my religion, as I told Bruce that, I'd just tell him I'm a born-again heathen. Because I have, that's because what my mother told me. Think about it. She says, don't just believe what anybody tells you. Now, in the early 1900s, the Kitselas people, they didn't want their children to go to residential school, so they built their own school. So most of us didn't go to residential school. Right? And it's actually quite a difference in the way I think and the way our Kitselas people think. The way we treat our families. Like, we never left our families, so we grew up with our families. I grew up with my grandmother who never spoke a word of English, right? And my mother died when I was about in my 30s, and at the entire time she never spoke English to me. Right? Never spoke English. So right, and that's because we didn't go to residential school. We didn't forget anything. We actually grew up to seeing what the old folks were doing. Remember, the old people at the time were born about 1850. There was around 1860, 1870. So they still knew it. And that's where we learned as children.
No, could you just speak a moment? You mentioned to me previously, why are there so few residential school survivors?
Yeah, there was a few that did go because they weren't living there. Like they were living in Port Essington or Prince Rupert or somewhere else, right? So that's why there wasn't very many. It's like nobody in my family went. It's like if you had like Rhoda, who just died last couple of weeks ago. She was one of those that never went. Her whole family didn't go. I think out of that, all her sisters and brothers, and so everybody stayed home. Like when we'd go to school, we weren't allowed to speak our language in school, but when you got home, you spoke it. And we were told not to speak it. We'd never paid any attention to that. We just kept doing it. Right? I remember kids getting strapped for speaking it in school, but as soon as they got home, they spoke it again. Right? So, and we didn't get, I guess one of the really bad things about residential school that I noticed is that you hear people talk about torn between two cultures. Right? With us, there is no such thing. We're all one people. You and I are all one people. There's no two cultures. There isn't. We're all one. But what they were taught in residential schools was that it was evil to be Indian. Being Indian was evil, right? And they actually, up in the Nass, they actually cut down all the totem poles and burnt them. Took all their all regalia and their masks and artifacts and burnt them, or they hauled them away to the museum, right? Because we never learnt that. We never learnt that we were evil. We never learnt that we were never taught that we were inferior, right? And so I never ever thought of myself as inferior, because I was never taught that. My mother always said we're not, right? So that's how we grew up. So it's a huge difference. You don't, you hear people talk about being proud of being Native. I never ever thought of that I'm just me. Right? And it'd be great if somebody did a study of what happened to the people who didn't go, right? There's so much stuff out there about what happened to the people who did go. What if they didn't go? Right? Anyway, in 1904, the BC Homestead Act was, go ahead.
I just was curious, who were the teachers at the school?
Mm-hmm.
You started your own school.
The teachers? They hired the teachers, and then when I was going to school, the Salvation Army took it over, and they were teaching. Right. So there were Salvation Army people. We had to go to Sunday school and all that stuff. I didn't learn very much, but that's how it was. And I actually have the only thing that survived. There was a big fire out there, and everything burnt up. But my dad happened to keep attendance records of the school, so I got everybody that went to school there. The days they missed, the days they were sick, the days they were gone fishing or out on the tramp line. It's all written down in there. Now the Homestead Act, again, that was passed, and the law stated any person may homestead in British Columbia except Indians.
I'm just curious, what was the amount of individual, like how many schools were there and how many individual approximately are we talking about? 10,000 or?
Say that again, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I'm just curious about the amount of individuals that didn't have to attend residential school. So are we talking about a population of 5,000, 10,000?
In Kitselas, you mean?
In Kitselas.
No, there's only about 300 of us.
Okay, 300.
There wasn't very many of us by then. Because you got to remember there was epidemics, flu epidemics, and what else was there? Smallpox and people moving away, right? People living in Port Essington, Prince Rupert. Right? And so there wasn't very many of us. Now again, what the point here is, says any person. It actually says any person except Indians or Chinese. Chinese weren't allowed to own land either. Native people in British Columbia were not allowed to own land. Right? The reserves aren't even owned by them. It's owned by the government of Canada, even today. The houses on reserve are owned by Canada. They're not owned by the people living in them. That's today. That's not 100 years ago. That's today. Right. Now, in 1931, I ran across a census that was taken for all of British Columbia, actually. And the population at Terrace was 352. So we were about equal. Right? And at that time, the native people in Askina were the majority, right? But they were confined to reserves, and everybody else was homesteading all around them. Right. Now, one of the good luck we actually had was 1935. Look, most of you probably know about this already. The oral history of Kitselas people was written in English by historian known, Walter Wright and his friend Will Robinson. The story that was memorized and told and retold for probably thousands of years. And the book is called the Minimadik. Like when they were in the preamble of the book, he talks about he was 65 at the time, I think. And he talks about that there's nobody left to remember the story, or people are just wandering off and doing other things. There's nobody interested in the story. It's going to disappear unless we write it down. So him and his friend Will Robinson wrote it, sat down for, it must have been at least 6 months it took them to write it. And because they started in the early summer and they were finished by Christmas, he said, which was working every day. And and Walter Wright said it takes, he had to memorize it word for word since he was, he said it takes 8 hours if you sat down and told it non-stop. It takes 8 hours to do that. And so, I guess the reason we're lucky, I always say this because are there any archaeologists or linguists in here? There's one. Is that it wasn't written by an archaeologist. Or a linguist, right? Because what they did was they sat down, discussed it, and wrote what it actually meant, as opposed to trying to do a word for word. They tried to tell the story as opposed to translate the story into English, right? So it's a unique book. There's no other book like it in North America that I know of, where a historian, an actual historian, it's not stories he heard over his lifetime. He was sat down for years and told and retold the story till he memorized it. Yeah? And that is kind of good luck on our part. And during that period, settlers and native people were fairly equal. Opportunities were equal. That one of the things that kind of irks me sometimes is when we talk about the native people as picking berries and doing all this stuff. Everybody did it. Non-native people picked berries. Non-native people fished and smoked fish. Non-native people hunted and did all the things we did. Right? It's not just us, right? We don't even do it anymore. I use my daughter as an example for blueberries. She gets them at Safeway. We don't go have pictures of native people crawling around the bush in the summer. We don't do that. Right? But it's a stereotype that kind of hangs on. No, and people were pretty well off. The Kitselas people were reasonably well off at that time. And the war with Japan made Terrace, a key inland area for training. Terrace was used quite a bit for training. So they had a military hospital here. They had huge buildings that they did their training and exercising and training, stuff like that. And so that really exploded. So things really changed for the Kitselas people. It wasn't equal anymore, right? I actually remember though, I was born January 1941, and on December of that year, that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed. But I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I still remember having to hide if the plane came over. And I still remember them, sugar and stuff were rationed. You're not allowed to have too much, so people would take boards off their walls and stuff sugar in there and nail them up so the people can't find them. I remember all of that stuff we used to do. To me, that's what the war was. And they used to, if you were misbehaving, they said the Germans are going to get you if you don't behave. I remember that. So, no, native people were not considered persons, right? There was an actual law that says a person is any individual who is not an Indian. So an Indian was not a person. So you could not join the army unless you denounced being Indian. But what it meant was you couldn't come home after, right? So a lot of the people didn't join the army. Some did, some didn't, and so up until 1945, the Kitselas people were actually part of the economy. We all worked here, fishing, fishing, logging, working in sawmills. Bill McRae actually hired all the Kitselas people. That's what they ended up in Usk, right? Most of the Kitselas people worked for Bill McRae. Some of you probably heard of him. And trapping was still good. Back then the prices were still good. People could still go out and spend a few months out in the trap lines and come back. But after 1945, the whole thing changed for us. Right? That in 1946 there was a major flu epidemic. I thought it was the Spanish flu until I did some research and found it wasn't. I can't remember what kind of flu it was, but killed a lot of people in Kitselas. And I was about 5 years old then. And I still remember it because our house was right on the road going to the church. And so there was a funeral every 2 weeks. Remember, we were talking about a small community of 150, 200 people. And there was a funeral every 2 weeks every 2 funerals a week. Every week for the winter. And every time somebody died, they'd ring the bell, church bell, right? And to this day, I hate the sound of church bells. I just cringe when I hear them. So I guess what do they call it? Post-traumatic stress disorder? Is that what it is? It really does make me jump. And that really affected Kitselas because for some reason it was mostly men that died. Mostly men died. So a lot of families just had women left. That included our family. There was the Mackenzie family. There was most of the families had just women ran everything, right? And because there were so many funerals, and it cost money even back then. You had to pay for the funeral, you had to pay for the coffin, all that. It pretty much cleaned out the whole community for money. So everybody was pretty much broke by the end by spring. and all the people who were workers who did the work and trapping and hunting, and they were all gone. Yeah. And so that was and us kids, we had to work. We started working when we were 6 years old, right? Yeah. We never did. I guess that's why we can't stop working right today. So a lot of the people that grew up in that time, they just worked. We never thought of it as chores, right? It's just something, somebody had to do it, so we did it. Like cutting wood, we used to, as 6-year-old kid with a crosscut saw cutting wood all day, right? Packing it, hauling it. We did everything. We never thought of, we didn't think anything, as kids we didn't think anything of it. We just did it, right? So over the next 10 10 years up to 1950. The school finally closed in 1956. That's when there was nobody left, no kids left. And there was no more, and there was hardly anybody living there. And in the spring of 1957, there was a grass fire that destroyed a row of houses, and our house included. And at the time, I actually, in 56, they told me I had tuberculosis, so I was in the hospital for a year. While I was there, our house burned down. So when I got out, I had absolutely nothing. Except some clothes that my sister bought me because I outgrew my old ones. And all our photographs, pictures, a lot of the old records that my mother kept, all kinds of stuff were gone. And that's the whole row of houses. And that basically became the end of the Kitselas community in 1956. There was pretty much nobody left. And then there was an attempt made by the band. And my mother was the chief councillor at the time. She was the one working on this. She was probably one of the first women chief councillors in Canada. And well, I don't know that for sure. I'm just, because there's hardly any. And we had, the Kitselas band had quite a bit of money actually put from that they've been off their own, but it's kept because the Department of Indian Affairs, if you make money on the reserve, Indian Affairs takes it. They look after it. They won't let you spend it. They decide what you use it for. My mother tried to get the houses rebuilt. And the Department of Indian Affairs, in their reason, they actually put it in the letter. They wrote her a letter. They said Kitselas is becoming extinct. And in their opinion, building homes would be a waste of money. So they couldn't even rebuild the houses they had. So there was nobody left there. I think there was only one family left behind that still lived there. That was Chris and Beverly. They were the last ones. So that pretty much the end of Kitselas. There were still houses up there, but there was nobody there. And for years, people people just walked away. There were a lot of the old tools and stuff that people just came in and walked away with them, stole them, right? So we couldn't do anything about it. And then it was almost true. The Kitselas almost did disappear. In 1962, I was first elected to the band council, and the voters list had 10 people on it.
I was kidding with Mel Bevan.
How many people were on the band now?
There was probably less than 50.
No, I mean on the band council. You've got
3.
3, okay.
Yeah. And so that, that was it. And there was nobody living on the reserve. I think Stan was born then. Susie wasn't yet. We had to start over again. Right, so around 1964, I think my son Stan was about this high. And my mother took me over to Queensway. It used to be called Airport Road. And showed me where that small reserve was. It was just a stump field because it had been logged off years before. It was just brush. So we just picked a spot, cleared it off. I was working on Skeena Forest Products at the time for Bill McRae, of course. And they sold us some lumber really cheap, right? So we got a lot of cheap lumber and we just started building. We did everything, except the wiring. The only thing I didn't dare tackle was the wiring. And that And then with a few years, others followed, like Ralph Wright came along and built a house. And then a few others came, the Bennett family came, the Mason family came. Pretty soon we had a community again, right? And when we filled that up, there's no room there anymore, we started Get Out. So from, and 60 years ago, it was expected we'd be extinct by now, right? But like I say, we're still alive. I'm still here. We are the descendants of those 500 people that stood on the, right? Stood on the canyon watching the world change. So we're back, right? You know, I think this might be the last one here. I got to keep my eye on the clock. You know, it's difficult to survive as individuals. It is, you know, it's tough enough. Being native, it's not easy. But it's really difficult to survive as a people. Right? All people, whether they're in Canada or anywhere else, have a strong desire to survive as a people. You know, and some of them didn't make it, like the Beothics in Newfoundland. They were wiped out. Same with the Tasmanians. The Aborigines in Tasmania were all wiped out. No matter what they did, they were just wiped out. It's not just native people. The Irish, if there's any Irish in here, they fought, still fighting, to maintain their identity as Irish people. And that's all over the world. Israel, the Palestinians, everybody, South Africans, they all want to survive as a people. You know, it's not enough just to say you're part of Canada, and so you're Canadian. We also want to survive as who we as it. You know, it's just human nature. You know, Kitselas people are the same as everybody else. We have the same burning desire to be who we are. Right? My mother, and then we get into treaties now. We're trying to take the next major step to change everything. And one of the things my mother said to me before she died was, never forget what your grandparents were trying to do. And that's really what triggered me to go into treaty negotiations. It's because that's what they were trying to do. So it's getting dry. Now, treaty negotiations, what we're doing, we're negotiating treaties. Most people think it's about land and money. It's not. It isn't. You know, it'd be nice to get a lot of our land back so that we've got something with the resources on it. But the money doesn't really mean anything because that disappears pretty quickly. It's really about controlling our own destiny on our homelands. The Nisga'a were able to do it. They were successful in doing it. The same in the north, in Yukon. The Yukon people have their own, they're controlling who they are. Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the James Bay Cree in Quebec, they're able to, it takes a long time to rebuild your society, and they're doing it. And that's really what treaties are all about to us. It's not about land and money. People think it's about money, it's not. 1 o'clock, dead on. And I thank you again for the acknowledgement, the opportunity, and I enjoyed talking to you, and it's good to see you here today. Thank you.
Now we'll be around for another hour or so for people who would like to have a discussion. He also has an office here, so feel free. And please feel free to join us for our next presentation, which is on the 11th in which
just
you won't
ask
be.
you, is there anything that interests you that I can, like treaties, you want to talk about treaties, self-government? I've been all over the country. If something that's really interesting to you, I'll try and come up with something.
We've tentatively said, sort of, we were talking with Mel, one of the things we had expressed an interest in was learning about Simoogit language and his particular views about how it should be taught. Another one was about the culture, about Kitselas culture, and the last one was about governance. I believe your daughter had agreed to do some of the presentation on governance, hasn't she, Mel?
I'm getting voluntold, I think.
So if there's any more, or if you'd like to arrange a private audience with Mel, please contact our front desk and we'll set up something.